All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening again, guys. Again, depending on when and where you're listening. Hope everything's going well with you guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up with the last lecture. So hopefully you guys are not watching, listening, doing this out of order. We're going to pick up from where we left off with our last lecture, which once I click share screen, boop, aha. We're going back to finishing off the background to English exploration. And then before or at the end of that, we're going to talk about the triangle trade. So at the end of last lecture, we were talking about the background to English exploration. We talked about the economic reasons, including this theory of mercantilism, the prime economic theory that operated out of Europe between the 15th and the 18th century. Remember, the theory is so nice, I put it on twice. We talked about how if based on, you guys could read, based on the prime idea of a finite supply of wealth in the world, the three principles of export more than you import, sell more than you buy, possess and project international power to protect your trade routes and your colonies, and colonies to benefit your mother country. We talked about the competition with Spain with respect to politics. We talked about how Liz and Philip were kind of like cats and dogs. And we talked about, speaking of dogs, we talked about the sea dogs, which led us into the Spanish Armada. Now, this is where we left off last time. So we're going to pick up with the social reasons behind English exploration. Now, on the social level, the primary push towards colonization came from the growing lack of farmland and an increasing population in England. And in the 16th century, that is the 1500s, you have a growing movement amongst the upper classes to start fencing in the common grounds located around most towns and villages. So most towns and villages would have a common green, a common area where they could take, if they had livestock, they could take them to the common area and have them eat, have them go out to pasture. But over time with this enclosure movement, the upper classes started fencing in more and more and more of those common grounds. And if you were a small farmer who didn't have a lot of land, relied on the common areas to feed your cow or feed your goat, and all of a sudden you don't have access to that, well, you're likely going to sell your goat or your cow or whatever. And who has the money to buy the goat, the cow, or whatever? Well, it's the same rich guy who just fenced in that land. And so they would end up not only getting more land, the rich get richer, but they would also buy the livestock from the poor and middle class people of the village, shifting everybody economically down a little bit. So what this meant was the amount of land that the lower class had less and less, in which they could use to feed their livestock. I mean, it would be like, I mean, you know how we have, if you're in Regina, you know how we have the common green space in the middle of campus. It would be like if the faculty decided, hey, that area is great for faculty. So we are going to fence off that area so nobody could play frisbee, throw the ball around, and we are going to set up a big old beer garden. No students allowed, just faculty. Similar sort of idea. So we have the enclosure movement where you have a growing lack of farmland, people feeling pushed, feeling pinched in by the economic uncertainties that's happening with this enclosure movement. You also have an increasing population. Now, colonization for England provided a safety valve for the social tensions caused by increasing population. Now, with the upper classes, you have this idea of primogeniture, 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 this idea that the inheritance is only going to the eldest son. What that means is the youngest son is generally sent to the New World. And what England also had was what was called a law of entail, Entail. And what that meant is that the inheritance could not be broken up. It had to be in one big chunk. So if you had a manor house with 20 acres, and over your lifetime, you bought another 150 acres. That means by the time you die, you had a manor house and 200 acres worth of land. Let's say you had 5 sons. The oldest son will get the manor house and everything. The other 4, well, you gotta kind of figure out what's going to happen to them before you die. And so in this hypothetical family of 5 sons, I'm the dad, I have 5 sons. Well, my first son, he will receive the inheritance. He will receive the manor house and the 200 acres of land. Well, for the second son, I would probably start working on a commission for him to get him commissioned as an officer in the army, to let him go out and do his own thing and bring pride to the family. Well, can't send the third son to the army. I already have somebody there. Well, let's send him to the Navy. Let's make him a naval officer and make him earn his name there. And then son number 4. Well, the first got the land, the second got the army, third got the Navy. I know, I will send him to university. I will send him to school and get him trained into the priesthood, into the Anglican Church. Well, son number 1 gets the land, 2 gets the army, 3 gets the Navy, 4 gets the priesthood. What am I going to do with that lucky number 5? I know, I will send him off to the colonies. I will give him a little bit of money, send him off to colonies and say, good luck, son. Go find your fortune in the New World. Now that's great for the upper class. I mean, inheritance and all that, but what about the rest of us who don't have inheritances, don't have rich folks, don't come from money? Well, for the lower classes, the New World represented the possibility of social advancement. It presented an opportunity to rise up in the social status that was not available, that was not present in England. So the lower class were often paid to travel to the New World in exchange for an agreement to labor for a particular period of time, generally about 7 years. So if I'm a middle class or a rich guy and I have territory in the New World, I'll go, sir or ma'am. I apologize, I don't know everybody's names yet, so I'm just going to use a generic sir or ma'am. Normally, I would pick on someone and be a little more individual about it. So, sir or ma'am, you're looking for social advancement. I will pay for your travel to the New World. I will get you there. All you have to do is work for me or work for my son for 7 years, and at the end, you will be free, and you could go and make your name for yourself at the colony. You won't be able to get to the colony otherwise. And many during this period said, yes, I will do that. This is a system called indentured servitude. INDENTURED, servitude. SERVITUD. Scroll all the way up. Boop, indentured servitude. So this is a system of labor known as indentured servitude. There we go. Now, what indentured servitude was, well, because particularly in colonies like Jamaica or in particular Virginia in the United States, there was widespread settlement to try and grow tobacco, and labor was needed to work the land. So white Englishmen, white English women would sell their labor for a set period of time, again, generally 5 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the colony. And during the period of servitude, they were treated as property. They could not be sold as a slave, for example, but they were treated as property, similar to an ass or a mule or a piece of some form of livestock. At the end of the term, provided they survive, the servant will receive freedom dues. This could be money to go and buy your own land. This could be seed. This could be tools. Sometimes this could even be land itself. It's important to note that this is not slavery. This system of labor is not slavery. It was entered into voluntarily. This was a legal contract between two individuals. There was a limited term of service. Once you hit your 5, 6, 7 years, however long, that's it. Your contract is over. You can go and do what you want. The children, if you had a child during your term of service, the child did not inherit the status of the parent. So this system of indentured servitude basically allowed England to have a bit of a safety valve, to allow England to ensure that social tensions did not rise up, did not explode as potentially as they could have. Which brings us to the triangle trade. So we talked about Spain in the age of exploration. We talked and the reasons why they explored politically and economically. We talked about the economic, political, and social reasons why England decided to go out and start exploring. Well, let's talk about this idea of a triangle trade. Now, remember, going back to mercantilism, prime economic theory of between the 15th and the 18th centuries. Colonies are necessary to, one, provide raw materials to the mother country, and number two, provide a market for goods from the mother country. In this instance, Europe used two areas of colonization. They used Africa and they used we'll just generalize, the New World. They used these two areas of colonization to benefit themselves and increase their wealth. So manufactured goods. I apologize, I hit the wrong button. Manufactured goods, guns, beer, iron, luxuries would go down to Africa, one point of the triangle. From Africa, these goods, guns, cloth, beer, iron, would be traded for natural resources, gold, ivory, hardwoods, or they would be traded for slaves. And then these, in particular, slaves would be sent to English colonies in the West Indies, as well as the North American colonies. And then they would grow things like sugar. They would grow things like rice, indigo, which would be sent back to England, turned into manufactured goods, sent back out, so on and so forth. So there's a triangle. That is a large version of the triangle trade. Now there's a smaller version of that sort of omits England. So let's start with slaves going from Africa. So slaves would go up to from Africa to the West Indies. In the West Indies, they would be made to put to work. They would be predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly put into work in sugarcane fields. So we would have sugar be harvested. Sugar would go up to Boston, go up to New York, where it would be converted into delicious, delicious rum. And then that rum, as well as other goods that were manufactured in North America, would be sent down to Africa, traded for slaves, sent to the West Indies, sugar, slaves, sugar, slaves, and so on and so forth. The idea with this idea of a triangle trade is to sort of show you guys in practice how mercantilism would work. Because throughout the entirety of the Atlantic Ocean, you would have, with Elizabeth, Her Majesty's, with any other king, His Majesty's, Royal Navy patrolling this entire area, protecting trade routes, protecting the colonies, protecting natural resources that would be sent to England or sent to the North American colonies, transformed, transmuted into manufactured goods, and then sold elsewhere, so that England would continue accruing wealth. All right, so that is the end of the origins. That is the end of the background to exploration. So we're going to not pause the lecture, but we're going to pause here for a second. And we're going to shift our view and focus more exclusively on Africa itself. Which means we are going to look at Africa and the African slave trade. As I said, at the beginning of every PowerPoint, I'm going to have a key terms and hard words. Again, these PowerPoints will be posted under the particular week, so you could either listen to my melodious voice and look at the PowerPoints, or you could have the video and look at the PowerPoints at the same time. So with respect to Africa and the African slave trade, we're going to look at the empires in Africa and Portuguese contact. We're going to look at the African slave trade itself. We're going to look at the process of enslavement. And then we're going to look at what's referred to by the French as le code noir, the black code. And then we're going to end the lecture with the Columbian exchange. Now, to start with, first and foremost, it's important to note the perception versus the reality of life and government in Central and West Africa. The perception of life and government in Central and West Africa, the European-centric perception, was Africa is a deep, dark continent with relatively decentralized governments focused on tribal relations. That's what the European thought. The perception, the European-centric perception, was Africa was just full of decentralized government with the focus on tribes. The reality was Central and West Africa had a number of empires rivaling European states with respect to size and population. The big difference is going to be technology, particularly as it comes to warfare. Europeans will have the advantage with gunpowder as well as steel weapons. The empires and governments in Central and West Africa are going to play an integral part, an integral role in the development of the African slave trade, sometimes by acting as middlemen between those capturing slaves and the Europeans. So yes, some Africans will be complicit in the enslavement of other Africans. Now, the first empire I want to talk about is what's known as the Songhai Empire. 1460 to 1591. And it's the reason that the Songhai Empire is important is because if you remember with the Portuguese, they're going to set up trade forts at and south of the Senegal River, which means they're going to have access to the trade network of the Songhai Empire. Now, the Songhai Empire is based around the city of Gao, G-A-O. Now, they will start, the empire will have humble roots. It will start as a tributary state of the Mali Empire, but will gain its independence after a series of civil wars in the Mali Empire that basically break that empire apart and allow for the rise of the Songhai Empire. Now, the Songhai Empire was based around the deltas of the Senegal and the Gambia rivers. So that's their exit point to the Atlantic. Based around the deltas between the Senegal and the Gambia rivers, the Songhai Empire was an Islamic state that controlled almost 1.4 million square kilometers at its height. So we're not talking a small, insignificant African decentralized state. We're talking a Islamic state in Africa that controlled 1.4 million square kilometers. Economically, the Songhai Empire was based around the gold trade. So gold would come up towards Timbuktu, gold would come up towards Gao. And the Songhai would provide military protection of the gold caravans as they made their way from the center of the continent to the west coast. These caravans would make their way to the two big Songhai cities, Gao and Timbuktu, where the Songhai would tax the incoming gold and provide a market where the merchants could come and trade with North African merchants. So the Songhai Empire essentially worked as a middleman between the merchants in North Africa and the traders in West Africa. Politically, the Songhai Empire was made up of a number of provinces, centrally controlled from Gao. The Songhai would appoint governors to these provinces who would be responsible for providing tribute in the form of provisions to both the provincial capital and the capital as well. So essentially, these provinces were set up to help feed the capital city. The Songhai also had a number of vassal states of their own, states that were indirectly controlled by the Songhai. These were states that had their own kings or queens, but were required to provide tribute in the form of goods, in the form of hostages, in the form of military troops. And it's their success, the success of the Songhai Empire, particularly with the gold trade, that got the attention of others who wanted in on the gold business. And the empire came to a sudden end when it was conquered by a Moroccan army in 1591. Morocco would be located up here in North Africa. Basically, they sent an army down to the Songhai Empire. They initially sent an army down to try to prevent the growing numbers of Portuguese traders that were engaging with the Songhai Empire. So they wanted to scare the Songhai away from dealing with the Portuguese. Morocco and Portugal as natural trading enemies. And so they attacked, attempting to force out the Portuguese and make sure the Songhai didn't trade with them. What ends up happening is the Moroccan army takes the capital city of Gao. And the lack of a solid central power structure from Gao essentially brings down the Songhai Empire, because without that strong, hard kernel of the capital city, things just sort of fall away. The different provinces start basically going, why do we have to listen to Morocco? They don't have anything to do with us. We can do what we want. And they start trading with Portugal even more. They start going their own way. And so what ends up happening? Well, the Portuguese, while they're started up here, had, yes, fewer access to the goods from the Songhai being taken out by the Moroccans. Rather than just sitting there and going, oh no, we can't trade anymore, they simply moved their focus down towards Ghana, down to the Gold Coast, down to the Slave Coast, basically just like other Europeans, moving away from the middlemen and going to the source. Now, more important with respect to the direct slave trade itself, we have the Kingdom of Congo. Kingdom of Congo, starting roughly about 1400, lasting to 1857. And it is based around the delta of the Congo River. So basically located, centered right around here. The Kingdom of Congo was the second major African power that the Portuguese dealt with. Whereas the focus of the Portuguese along the Senegal and Gambian rivers with the Songhay Empire was the trade in gold, the growing focus of the Portuguese along the South Niger River and the Congo rivers were slaves. So with the Songhay, yes, there was some slave trade going on, but the focus was primarily on the gold trade, mercantilism, getting more wealth into the coffers, getting more wealth into the vault, so other people can't get it. With respect to Kingdom of Congo, the main money maker there is going to be the slave trade. Now, the Portuguese will negotiate with coastal powers like the Kingdom of Congo to establish trade forts along the delta of major rivers and focused on the trade of luxury goods depending on the area. That would be why with the Songhay, they focused on gold as a luxury good. But the Kingdom of Congo did not have the trade resources of the Songhay Empire, but had the natural resources that Portugal was looking for, as well as luxury items, including slaves. Because amongst the nobility of the Kingdom of Congo, the purchase and owning of slaves was considered a matter of status. To be able to own slaves within the society of the Kingdom of Congo, meant that you had status within Congo society as an outward display of wealth. For the Portuguese, they were looking at slaves to work their growing sugar plantations on the islands just off the west coast of Africa. So because slavery was considered a luxury good amongst the nobility of the Kingdom of Congo, the Portuguese naturally focused on that luxury good, as well as the desire for labor to work their own sugar plantations. Now, politically, the Kingdom of Congo will be smaller than the Songhay Empire. Songhay Empire, about 1.4 million square kilometers. Kingdom of Congo, you're looking at about 130,000, my apologies, 130,000 square kilometers, with a population of about 300,000 men. So the Kingdom of Congo had a standing army of about 5,000 men, increasingly armed with European weapons, to ensure stability of the kingdom. And they had a large extended royal family that they sent out as governors to the various provinces. With respect to the Kingdom of Congo, they wanted the trade goods to keep coming into Congo, particularly guns, particularly ammunition. So many of the royal family, many of the nobility, would convert to Christianity as a show of good faith. And many would, in fact, become good Christians. But most of the subjects, most of the lower middle classes, developed an Afro-Creole religion, which fused aspects of Christianity with local traditions. So politically, we have a solid, relatively stable kingdom. Now, what impact did the Portuguese trade have in Africa? What impact did it have in the Kingdom of Congo? The major impact of Portuguese and European trade overall along the west coast of Africa was that it disrupted traditional power structures in Africa. European goods, particularly weapons, particularly guns, would tilt the balance of power towards those kingdoms and those governments who were closer to the European traders. The Kingdom of Congo, for example, had access to Portuguese muskets, and therefore, of their 5,000 man army, were able to have a 500 man unit of musketeers, men who only used the musket in its military. And having resources such as these allowed coastal governments, coastal powers, to grow in power at the expense of inland governments. So, governments in Central Africa would start waning in power, going down in power, as governments along the coast, like the Kingdom of Congo, getting European goods, started going up in power because they have more access to European goods that were starting to become more and more and more necessary. Now, there are two problems for Africans with respect to trading with Europeans. You might think, hey, that's great, they're getting access to all these wonderful goods. But there are two problems for Africans with respect to trading with the Europeans. First, these states were becoming more and more and more dependent on European goods and European weapons. For example, your army may need replacement parts for muskets that break down. Or they might have a lot of muskets, but if the Europeans are not selling you ammunition for them, they are basically as good as a basic club. So you're becoming more and more and more dependent on Europeans for European goods and European weapons. Secondly, these goods could destabilize coastal states as provinces trading with the Europeans could rebel against their larger larger centralized state, simply because they have access to weapons that the centralized state may not have, breaking down the cohesiveness of this state and breaking it down into its constituent parts. So yes, Europeans are coming to Africa. They're seeing these smaller states, but they don't realize that part of the reason why they're having these larger states is that their goods are destabilizing other states inland. So these are just two examples, the Songhai Empire and the Kingdom of Congo, to show that there were centralized large empires and large governments and large kingdoms in Africa during this period. It's not just tribal relations. There were large centralized states in Africa during this period. Which brings us to the Atlantic slave trade. And I broke it down into two parts. I've broken it down into the process of enslavement, and then we're going to talk about what's called Le Code Noir. So, the process of enslavement for the African slave trade, I skipped ahead. So this is how it's going to be broken down. The Atlantic slave trade, I'm going to talk about the process of enslavement, then I'm going to talk about Le Code Noir. And for the process of enslavement, it can be broken down into three constituent parts. There we go, three constituent parts. The first part of the process of enslavement is from the interior to the coast. The second part of the process of enslavement is the Middle Passage. And then the third and final part of the process of enslavement is the slave market itself. So we're going to look at the interior to the coast first and foremost. So we've talked about coastal kingdoms like the Kingdom of Congo. Now, if you have somebody saying, hey, we want slaves, we want to buy slaves from you, your first instinct is not to go and enslave your own people and sell them off to somebody. Your first instinct, the natural instinct, is to go, hey, I don't like those guys over there. I'm going to attack them. I'm going to take the people I don't like, bring them over here, then sell them to the Europeans, and oh yeah, I'm going to take their land while I'm at it. So coastal African kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Congo, would send out raiding parties into the interior of Africa to seize slaves to be sold to the Europeans. So coastal African kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Congo, would send out raiding parties to the interior. So it was not Europeans who were capturing these slaves, it was these coastal kingdoms, at least early on, where they would kidnap fellow Africans and bring them back to sell them to the Europeans. These slaves would be brought in chains from the interior to the coast, where they would be brought and placed into buildings referred to as factories. I will go back to this slide in a second. So this is a contemporary sketching of a European factory. And so a factory is not like a factory of what we think about today, where people go and manufacture something like a shoe factory or a warehouse, but rather a factory in this sense is the political, social, and economic center of European power in that region. So the Portuguese would have their factory. The English in their forts would have their factory. Spanish, and so on and so forth. And so they would be brought to the factory. The slaves would be brought to the factory. And within these factories, the slaves would be inspected, and it would be decided where they would be sold. In some cases, the companies involved would brand their slaves in a similar manner that cattle are branded. The Royal African Company, the main company that would buy and sell slaves for the English, would brand their slaves with a DY, representing the main shareholder in the company, the Duke of York. That is the king's brother. Almost half, 45.5% of all slaves, 45.5% of all slaves are going to come from the coast, from the West African coast. An area that was more and more increasingly controlled economically for the slave trade, as well as politically, by the Kingdom of Congo. So 45.5% of all slaves will be coming from this region right here, predominantly the area controlled by the Kingdom of Congo, and sent over to the so-called New World, with a majority of them going to Brazil, smaller numbers going to the French Caribbean, the Dutch, the Netherlands, would have their colonies. British would have their colonies. The Danish would have, Denmark would have their own colonies, as well as Spain and North America. The majority will go to South America, followed by the Caribbean, with a minority, small number, going to British North America. So at these factories, slaves would be weighed. So here we have, again, a contemporaneous etching where we have a female slave on one side of a scale, and the Europeans are basically putting weights on the other side of the scale to figure out, A, how much the slave would weigh, and B, there's no way to put it, what sort of price that person would fetch based on their weight. So it would be at these factories after slaves would go, after coastal African nations would go out on a raid, take captives take slaves, bring them and sell them to the Europeans. They would be in these factories, and these factories were not pleasant places. I've seen some pictures. A professor of mine went to Africa, walked through some of these factories, and some of them are no better than a cave with a hole carved out as a window. So these are not pleasant places to be in. So that's the first part of the process of the enslavement, going from the interior to the coast. Now, the second part of the process of enslavement is referred to as the Middle Passage. Referred to as the Middle Passage. Now, once it was decided where the slaves would be sold to, slaves would be placed on ships. They would be packed like sardines on these ships for the up to 6-month trip to the New World. The time of travel varied depending on the distance they were traveling and the weather and sea conditions. Slaves could be forced to go above decks and dance for the sailors as a way of exercise. But for the most part, for 23 hours a day, they were chained underneath. They were chained in the bowels of the ship, and disease would run rampant due to the poor conditions. So you're looking at a mortality rate just in the Middle Passage, just going from Africa to the New World, of 12 to 15%. And if we're looking at the numbers vary, the best estimate, the generally accepted estimate of the number of slaves heading from Africa to the New World is about 12 million slaves. That's the number that arrived in the New World. If you're looking at a mortality rate of even 10%, that means at least 1.2 million people will die between 1700 and 1800 on the Middle Passage. And that's a conservative estimate of 10%. More typically, you're looking at between 12 and 15%. And as I said, they are packed in as sardines. This is a plan, and I'll read what it says between the two sketchings. This is a plan showing the storage of 130 additional slaves around the wings or sides of the lower deck by means of platforms or shelves in the matter of galleries in a church. The slaves stowed on the shelves and below them only have a height of 2 feet 7 inches between the beams and far less under the beams. So typically you would have, even being fair, 2 feet 7 inches. You have about a meter of height that you're chained to. And people, slave trading ships, are looking for things like these sketches, because the more people you could get on these ships, the higher your profit margin is going to be. I mean, if you could stow, 130 additional slaves, that might add up to 1, 2, 3, 5 less trips that you might have to take for the same amount without this extra space. So you're saving money. From an economic perspective of a slave trader. To give you an example, at the end of the PowerPoint, I have 2 links. The first is for Roots. The second is for 12 Years a Slave. For the Middle Passage, I recommend you. I normally show this in class. Watch the YouTube video of Roots. Just watch to about 3.5 minutes to get a sense of what these slaves might have been experiencing in the Middle Passage. For the slave market itself, I have a YouTube clip from 12 Years a Slave, one of the best movies regarding American slavery I've seen. If you have a chance, read the book. It's actually quite readable. So we have the Middle Passage. That's part 2 of the process of enslavement. So we go from the interior to the coast in part 1, from the interior to these European factories. Part 2 is the Middle Passage. And then we have the slave market itself. Once slaves arrived in the New World, they would be placed in the slave market to be sold. And white men, women, and children would come out to the market and look at the buying and selling of human beings like a Sunday, for some it would be their Sunday outing. It would be like going to a fancy auction or going to a car auction and not buying anything but seeing everything for sale. The slaves in the market would be treated like cattle. They would have their teeth inspected. Prospective owners would often bring their own medical professionals to give the slaves a once-over. And they would be interrogated. They would be, I almost said asked, they would be interrogated about what sort of skills they have, what sort of upbringing did they have, what sort of what sort of skills they obtained over time. And again, I direct you to the bottom of the PowerPoint to the YouTube clip of 12 Years a Slave to give you an idea of, at least from an American slave market, what the slave market would be like. Now, I have to emphasize, I am not trivializing the slave trade when I'm going to make this analogy. What happened with respect to the slave trade was a horrible system. It treated people in a horrible, horrible manner. But I've found in the past that this analogy I'm about to give allows students to more easily remember the process of enslavement. So if you think about it, Star Wars gives you a good example of the process of enslavement. And what do I mean by this? Again, I'm not trivializing slavery. It was a horrible, horrible system. But really, if you think about it, the scene with the Jawas in Star Wars is really reminiscent of the slave trade. Jawas will capture R2 and 3PO. They will put them in a cramped crawler, the Middle Passage. And then at the end, they will sell them to a couple of white guys. And again, I'm not trivializing slavery. Slavery was a horrible system. It treated human beings in a horrible manner. But this is a means by which, if it works for you to remember what the process of enslavement was like, by all means, use it. Now, there were 2 main areas. Going back to this map. There were 2 main areas for the sale of slaves in the New World. 46% of all slaves who survived the Middle Passage found themselves arriving in Brazil, while 42% would find themselves arriving somewhere in the Caribbean. Both of these areas were heavily invested in the production of sugar, and sugar plantations required an immense investment in labor. The working and living conditions in sugar plantations were such that the average field hand, the average slave on a sugar plantation would only live 5 to 6 years. In some cases, slaves were literally worked to death and then replaced by another slave. In other cases, tropical diseases would infect slaves who did not have any immunities, and they wouldn't last a year. For slave owners, the death rate for slaves was such that it was cheaper for them to just purchase a new slave than it was to take care of their existing slaves. Now, one of the main locations in the Caribbean for the British was Jamaica. And I know I'm slipping a little outside of the aspects of this course, but this gives you an idea of how invested Britain would be in natural resources with respect to their colonies, in this case, sugar. In 1660, Jamaica had a ratio of 4,500. Whoop, my apologies, I did not mean to pause the sharing. Jamaica had a ratio of 4,500 whites to 1,500 slaves, about a 3-to-1 ratio. By the time Britain abolished slavery in 1834, that ratio has gone from 3-to-1 whites to slaves to 20-to-1 slave to white. And how much did this affect the British shipping economy? By 1700, 1 out of every 4 ships leaving Liverpool, England, was a slave trading ship. And much of the wealth created by the British harbour towns, particularly Liverpool, particularly Manchester, was created either directly or indirectly by slavery. 75% of all sugar produced in Jamaica found its way to London to supply the growing coffee craze in that town. During the sugar heyday, you're looking at almost 58,000 tons of sugar per year. My teeth are falling out just thinking about that. 58,000 tons of sugar per year. So the European colonial powers, particularly England, particularly France, will find themselves heavily invested in slavery. And with this detour, I want to sort of shift to what the French are doing. Because the French are going to enact a series of a legal system called Le Code Noir. And I want to talk about this not only because how it sets up in the European mind this color coding system. White is high up, brown a little further down, black all the way at the bottom, and how it's this color coded mindset is going to transpose itself into South Asia, into the Middle East, into China. And I want to talk about Le Code Noir, the French system of slavery, because the legal system that it developed was often copied by the different empires as well. Now, Le Code Noir was designed by King Louis XIV to control and regulate slavery in the colonies in 1685. In 1685, Louis XIV passed Le Code Noir to control and regulate slavery in the French colonies. In theory, this was to regulate slavery throughout the French colonies, even those that had little by way of slavery, such as New France. New France did have some slavery, but not to the extent that you would find, say, in Haiti. But in practice, the enforcement of Le Code Noir varied from colony to colony. Now, one of the things that Le Code Noir did, there we are, was it institutionalized this idea of law of the womb. It institutionalized this idea of law of the womb. That is, it legally set the status of the child. If this, basically, the law of the womb said the status of any child, white, black, brown, whatever color, whatever race, the status of the child is based off the status of the mother. If the child had a slave mother, then that child would be legally considered a slave. If a child has a free mother, regardless if it's a free black, free white, if a child has a free mother, then that child would legally be free. So Le Code Noir 1685 institutionalized this idea of the law of the womb, an idea that will be copied in other European colonial powers. In addition, it determined the status of slaves that were freed by their masters. Now, masters over the age of 20, that was considered the age of majority. Masters over the age of 20 could individually, for themselves, determine whether or not to free a slave. So if upon reaching the age of 20, a young man decides to free the slave that basically raised him, he could do so. And a slave who is freed, now a freeman, would be considered to be French subjects and had the same rights and privileges of any free white French colonial subject. So not only did it determine the status of the children, it determined the status of slaves who were freed individually by masters. And of course, a freed slave, if they had children based on the law of the womb, their children would be considered free as well, provided the mother is a free woman. Le Code Noir required masters to provide a bare minimum of food, clothing, shelter. I mean, the bare necessities of life. Required masters to provide their slaves food, clothing, and shelters to their slaves. Now, Le Code Noir did not specify the type of food, type of clothing, type of shelter. And so many masters would just do the bare minimum. Oh, look, there's a lean-to. They have a roof over their head. That's shelter. I have some week old bread that's almost about to go rotten. I will give that to my slave. I have these raggy ass clothes that are about to fall apart. I will give them to my slave. There, I provided food, clothing, shelter. So Le Code Noir said there's a requirement but did not specify, and each colony sort of determined for themselves, interpreted for themselves, how much that requirement was followed. In addition, and this is where we get to some of the more icky parts of the Code Noir, it allowed for the corporal punishment of slaves and the punishment of slaves for certain behaviors. Masters were allowed to chain and beat their slaves, but prohibited from torturing or mutilating them. And that makes a little bit of perverse sense because slaves were considered property. And so if you decide to sell a slave as a buyer, you want to get the best value you can. Pardon me, the best value you can. So it's like buying a car today. You are going to get somebody to inspect your car, and if there is a problem with the car that will seriously affect the value you're getting, you have legal recourse against the person who sold you, provided you have a contract. Rule number one, always get a contract, always get it written down. Same thing here. A mutilated slave, a slave that has been harmed in such way to prevent them from working as hard as they can, a lame arm, for example. That devalues that slave. Slavery devalues a person to begin with, but economically that devalues that slave. And so masters who tortured or mutilated their slaves would be subject to fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment themselves. And you might be asking yourself, gee, how would they tell if a master is torturing their slaves? If you've ever lived in a small town Saskatchewan, well, you know that word gets around quick, rumor gets around quick. So-and-so hears something from their sister, who heard it from their boyfriend, who heard it from his cousin, that Mark is torturing his slaves. And so there will be effectively a buildup of social pressure that would eventually lead to an investigation. So masters were allowed to chain and beat their slaves, but prohibited from torturing or mutilating them. A slave who struck his or her master, his or her mistress, or the children could be executed. So I'm not sure how many of you guys have young siblings, young nieces or nephews or cousins or what have you. 3-year-olds need some discipline in their life. So if a slave goes and gives a 3-year-old son of his master a good whap on the bottom because the tot is acting like a snot-nosed little brat, according to the Code Noir, that would give the master pretense to have that slave executed. Now, that's not to say, oh, you slapped a little kid on the bottom, you're dead, but it gives them the ability to extend punishment as far as death. Now, for slaves that ran away, and there were many slaves that ran away or tried to run away, a slave who ran away and returned to the plantation for the first time. So even if you decided, I'm going to run away from my slave plantation in Regina, I'm going to go down the road to Moose Jaw, and you returned and it was discovered that you ran away and returned, the first time that happened, you would have your ears cut off and be branded as a runaway. And let's say that pisses you off and you said, screw this, I'm going to leave my plantation, I'm never going to come back. After 4 or 5 days, you come back really hungry because you're not able to find any food. So the second time you run away and return to the plantation, you would have your hamstrings cut and you'd be branded again. If you manage somehow to crawl out on your hands and knees, escape the plantation, and returned either by yourself or by a posse, well, you would be subject to execution. It's important to remember that these regulations were not always as enforced as fully as they should be. And so the various European powers are going to have similar legal systems with respect to slavery. And these legal systems will, in the social mind of society, start associating color with degrees of freedom. And so when Europeans are going to go to South Asia, when they're going to go to China, when they're going to go to the Middle East, they're going to take these ideas along with them. So that is the Code Noir. That is Africa and the slave trade, talking about empires in Africa and Portuguese contact, the Atlantic slave trade. I'm going to end this lecture with the Columbian Exchange. Now, as this shows, the Columbian Exchange is the cultural, biological, and economic exchange between European and native groups in the New World. I would put a date between the 15th and the 18th century. The Columbian Exchange is the cultural, biological, and economic exchange between European and native groups in the New World. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Hint, hint. So when we're talking biological exchange, that's relatively straightforward. We're talking exchange in diseases. The New World's getting diseases that they've never had exposure to. The New World, the Europe is getting exposure to similar diseases. Biologic can also include flora, plants, fauna, animals. Potatoes going to Europe, sugar coming to the New World, for example. Economic exchange, that's relatively straightforward. I have a gun, I will trade you 5 pieces of silver for it. Done. That's your economic exchange. Cultural exchange is the one that normally trips people up. Whenever you meet somebody from a new society for the first time, so let's say you are traveling from Regina, Saskatchewan to Oslo, Norway, or let's say somewhere different. Instead of Oslo, congratulations, you have been planted straight down in, I don't know, let's put you in New Delhi, India. Now, you might not know how to speak Hindi, the local, the language in India. So the first thing you're going to want to do is try to set up a means of communication between yourself and everybody else. That could include learning the local language, local dialects. That could involve you learning specific signs or signals to communicate. Language is a cultural exchange. Religion, that's another idea of cultural exchange. That's a cultural exchange, and we're going to see how religion plays out in Europe in the next video lecture next week. But the Columbian exchange, the cultural, biological, and economic exchange between European and native groups in the New World. And as a date, I would put between the 15th and 18th centuries. All right. Stop sharing. So gang, that is it for this video lecture. That is it for this week's lecture. So I will basically post a series of lectures Monday or Tuesday, definitely Tuesday before 11 p.m. And basically you would have the next week in order to watch, in order to take your notes. And again, don't forget, I will be in our virtual classroom to answer any questions you might have on Thursdays, except for May 26th, the Tuesday before the midterm exam. I will be in there on Tuesday, May 26th to answer any questions you might have about the midterm exam as well. So I'm going to let you guys go there. Good luck, and I hope to see some of you guys, many of you guys, all of you guys on Thursday. Again, it's a drop-in, drop-out. There is no attendance policy. I will not be taking note going, Jim Richardson, check. Jane Smith, check. I won't be doing that. It's up to you whether or not you want clarification, but I will be a resource available to you guys for that clarification. Have a great day, and I will hopefully see you on Thursday.